I have a friend who I've known for several years before she ever shared this story, and it had stayed with me ever since. She grew up in an old colonial in Illinois. Starting when she was around 3 or 4, when she would sleep alone in her room, she would hear footsteps coming down the attic at night and down the hallway to her room. Into her room would come a man, wearing an old trench coat and an old-fashioned fedora. He never heard or spoke to her. He would just sit there, on her bed, staring blankly in her direction. If she attempted to scream in fear, he would put his hand over her mouth. Her parents later said they heard muffled screams coming from her room. She would beg her parents not to sleep in her room and often slept on the floor in her parents' room or with her brother, yet she was too horrified to actually tell anyone what scared her. Finally, after about 3 years I think, he stopped coming and she never saw him again. In high school, she finally told her mother what had been going on. Her mother felt guilty for not finding out sooner, so decided to research a little about the history of the house. The only unusual thing that they could find was that the house had been owned for many years by a local dentist, whose young daughter had died as a child. Whether she actually died in the house is unknown. My friend and her parents had since moved to the East Coast. Fast forward 30 odd years. One day, my friend's mother runs into a woman who now lives in that same house. My friend doesn't know these people or has had any other contact with them before. Her mom and the current owner were chatting about the house when the owner mentioned how her granddaughter often visits and sleeps in the room that used to be owned by my friend. The owner then says, laughing, "And when my granddaughter does come and sleep in the room, she says something funny every time. She tells me a strange man visits her when she's sleeping." Strange child, huh? Strange child? I mean, look, I'm a very rational person, but the idea that 2 little girls who have never spoken or seen each other 30 years apart would make up the same exact story kinda defies coincidence in my mind. So, this didn't happen to me, but it happened to my aunt, and it's so freaky I'll never forget it. My aunt and uncle bought a cool small Victorian about 40 miles away from Austin. It was a pretty awesome place actually, with a historical marker in the front lawn and everything. My aunt and uncle moved due to job reasons years ago, and the house is now a successful bed and breakfast. Why anyone would pay money to sleep there though, is beyond me. When my aunt and uncle were still living in the house, their daughter and her young son also lived with them. Chad, the son, was about 7 at the time. One day, my aunt was home alone. My uncle and her daughter were both at work, and Chad was at school. The lady who usually cleans the house had already left for the day. My aunt was in the study, working on a project or something. In this house, if you sat at the desk in the study, you would have clear view of the foot of the stairs. She was busy on her computer when she looked up and saw something terrifying. Sitting there in silence at the foot of the stairs, with a cold expression on his face, was a young boy. She estimated him as around the same age as Chad. She just assumed he was a friend from school. Hi, what's your name?" The boy stared blankly through her eyes without moving a single muscle. She didn't feel at ease with the situation, so she told him to leave and go home or go to school or something. She then looked down for a mere second, and looked up again and found an empty staircase. The boy vanished. Gone. She heard no footsteps, and the moment of her looking down and up again was too short for him to actually run down the stairs. That afternoon, Chad came home, and his mother told him about the friend who visited the house. "No way," Chad said. "All my friends were at school with me." She then described the boy, and Chad got real quiet. "Oh, yeah, I know him. He comes out of my closet to play sometimes at night. I don't like him." Unnerved and in shock, she told him to go play outside and stop telling wild stories. Months passed. One day, the aunt was doing some research about the history of the house. She found out that a young boy, aged 8, died there of leukemia in the 70s. She then found an old newspaper article about his death with a picture she recognized. It was the same boy from the staircase, the boy that was staring straight at her, and then vanished moments later. When I was 5 years old, my family moved to Coburg, a suburb of Melbourne. My bedroom was an old dining room. My sisters shared one of the front rooms and my parents the other. Literally, the first night there, I couldn't sleep at all. It was warm and I kept tossing and turning. I turned over again and was facing the door for already the 100th time that night. Something shocking happened at that moment. Something I've only seen in poor-made horror movies or in scary tales. I saw a figure. An unsettling, creepy figure of what looked like a woman with no feet. It looked like the figure was floating midair and moving from the bedroom door to my cupboard, while slowly fading away and eventually disappearing. I was so terrified. I had never felt such great fear in my life. I tried to scream and yell for help, but only tears slowly filled my eyes. Moments that felt like hours had passed, and my body finally let out an extremely agonizing scream that made my father run in my room with a worried expression on his face. Stammering and stuttering and finding the right words, I told him exactly what I saw. He reassured me that there was no such thing as ghosts. From that moment on, I felt even more afraid and alone, and I knew I was on my own. He told me not to worry and go back to sleep. I then laid with my back to the door and eventually fell asleep. The next night, I was facing the door and I was trying to fall asleep. I then, to my surprise, saw the same figure of the woman do the exact same thing as the night before. It kept appearing and reappearing at the door, floating to my cupboard for at least 7 times that night. I was less afraid as it was not harming me in any way, so I fell asleep again, this time quicker. Over the night I got used to it and was quite fascinated with what ghosts actually were. I watched it come into my room night after night, still frightened somewhat, but no use in telling my dad. As he said, ghosts don't exist. One night, just after my dad closed his bedroom door, I saw a white flash shoot across my bedroom. I thought it was something ghostly like before again, so I faced towards the wall and tried not to think of it. That was when I noticed a bright light shining through my room. I tried to work out what it could be, but I couldn't. I was watching the light on the wall. It was like a perfect circle, bright as a small torch. That's when the shadow appeared on the wall. A skinny silhouette with skinny arms reaching out to me. It opened its mouth to reveal sharp teeth and I assumed it was trying to hurt me. I closed my eyes as tight as I could and tried to scream as loud as I possibly could, but again, it was like my throat was squeezed tight and my voice abandoned me. After the longest minute, I could finally cry out to my dad over and over. My dad came rushing in, but the same story. He just said it was my imagination or a bad dream or whatever. I cried myself to sleep that night. The next day, my dad thought it would be a good idea to get me a nightlight. It turned out to be a big mistake, but at least he tried to help. That night, the nightlight was on. I faced the door that night in absolute fear. I watched the figure of the feetless woman do her usual business from my door to the cupboard, but this time, it was worse. With the nightlight on, I could see the lady's face much clearer, which scared the crap out of me. I turned to the wall and couldn't close a single eye. But then, I was tapped on the back twice by an icy, stiff finger. I let out a short scream and jumped up and turned around. That is when I was looking into those eyes. The lifeless white eyes with no actual iris or pupil. The unforgiving, creepy grin the woman had on her face. I was overwhelmed with the greatest fear I've ever experienced. My throat was dry and I could barely blink. I pulled the blankets over my head and faced the wall. I tried to force myself into thinking of positive things. I kept repeating, flowers, flowers, pretty flowers, over and over in my head until I fell asleep. I never slept with the nightlight on again and took it out of the plug. Every time I would lay facing the door, I would see the dark figure again and again, but needless to say, I almost always faced the wall. She thankfully never came as close as she did that other night, ever again. Her presence continued though, for about 3 years until we finally moved out when I was 8. I'm now a grown woman and I've experienced more horrifying things, but for now, this is the story I'm telling you. More to come though, perhaps.